Cyberpunk 2077, a word in two parts, cyber and punk. What does this mean? Cyber seems obvious, it's high-tech and probably future-based, 2077 confirms this, but I'm most interested in the second half of this word, punk. I have a long relationship with this word. I was a nerd growing up, but I knew of the punks. I wasn't friends with them, at least not until after I graduated, but I was always aware of this concept of punk. I come from a rural area, so until I went to high school in the suburbs, punk was just a genre of music to me that meant fast-paced beats and not doing what your parents tell you. That was all I knew. There was some kind of general feeling of rebellion, like lyrics and slogans about cops that I had absolutely zero context for, since I didn't speak to a cop until I was 19 and finally got my first speeding ticket. I was a white, mild-mannered nerd who just wanted to be left alone and play video games. However, I did listen to a lot of punk music. One line always stuck out to me and has echoed in my head for so long that it feels like an organic thought that I produced. Are you ready to hear this profound artistic message delivered by the most respected and most deep thinkers of our time, Blink-182? To paraphrase, nobody likes you when you're 23 and you still act like you're in freshman year. What the hell is wrong with me? My friends say I should act my age. What's my age again? What's my age again? And later, with many years ahead to fall in line, why would you wish that on me? It was only about a decade later that I finally started to understand what it really means to be a punk. As I felt my many years ahead slowly come closer and closer on the horizon, I wondered when these lyrics would stop feeling so powerful to me and my life. When would I see Blink-182 with the cynical, world-weary viewpoint that the old people all around me seemed to share, back when I was a 15-year-old nerdy punk poser? I kept looking to society and others to define my age and keep having to ask myself and them, what's my age again? When would I feel like an adult and fall in line? Any day now, I assumed. That day never came. If anything, I feel like I only relate to and understand this sentiment deeper every passing year. At 18, I started to realize this song was not just about interpersonal relationships and also had to do with one's relationship to the wider culture. At 20, I realized that the song was a rebellion anthem against corporations that wanted to control your time and monetize your limited lifespan. At 22, I couldn't believe I was almost the age in that song, yet I was still seeing controlling and fall-in-line messages all around me in culture. At 23, I didn't feel like I was that much different from that kid in freshman year. Turns out the song really did describe me, and my years of feeling like a poser were maybe a little more authentic in retrospect. At 27, I listened to the song after a long time and realized I had flown past the year of 23 and still didn't feel like I was going to fall in line anytime soon. Sure, I was gainfully employed for years at that point, even moving my thoughts towards starting a family and all the other trappings of a successful life under capitalism, but I still felt like a real individual, not the sheeple that I heard so much about when I was a teen. I was still analyzing my environment and its influences on me, figuring out what free will is and isn't, all thoughts I had been having since I was that 15-year-old boy connecting to this song. At the age of 29, I realized I have ADHD, and at 30 I was diagnosed. As I write this script at 31, I'm on Concerta, essentially a form of Ritalin, to keep myself from going and clicking open the minimized Cyberpunk 2077 game instance on my taskbar. I frequently think of the line, "What the hell is ADD?" and how my relationship with this line has changed so drastically over time. First, it was a funny joke, and now I view it as an ominous portent that went unnoticed all those years. Perhaps I had actually grown up at some point, and I'm not the same as that freshman listening to Take Off Your Pants and Jacket on the bus with my Walkman CD player, yet strangely it seems I'm closer now to who I thought I was back then than ever before. Low Society is a podcast I love. I'm a patron, and I've followed the work of its creators quite closely. However, they had a take on Cyberpunk on a recent episode that inspired this response, and, if nothing else, made me decide to add my voice into this conversation. To some degree, I felt their discussion missed the entire point of this artistic work, or at least circled around what I felt is the point. To be clear, this is not a criticism of them, and I highly recommend you go find their show and give it a try. In my opinion, they went about as deep as you can get in a casual conversation podcast format. Here's the thing. To me, that difficulty of discussion contributes to the fantastic, long-form, artistic statement in this game. Let me explain.
Body count lottery rounded out to a solid and sturdy 30. 10 out of
The world of Cyberpunk needs to be a world for punks to exist in, by definition. Punks are anti-establishment underdogs, so therefore, the world of Cyberpunk needs some establishment to be the enemy, and the enemy needs to be winning this fight. Punks stop being punk as soon as they start being the majority. This is the interesting paradox to rebellion. At what point do rebels become the establishment, and when do the punks flip to the other side? How many punks in real life are only in the scene to be oppositional? Anarchism, as a concept, tends to yada-yada the area between be a rebel and institute a hierarchy-free system. For this very reason, underdogs are sexy, and I strongly believe that many people attached to punk aesthetics would be turned away if they felt there was ever a realistic threat of that aesthetic becoming truly mainstream. How often are these self-identified punks talking about selling out? Hint, it's often. In Cyberpunk, the setting, not the genre for the record, capitalism no longer exists as a discrete entity separate from reality. It is the world for 99% of the inhabitants of this dystopia, and even more so for the residents of Night City. In many ways, Cyberpunk's post-late-stage capitalism portrayal of a liberal dystopia is the only logical projection of the world that we live in now, without some kind of powerful intervention. Even the punk aesthetic has been recuperated into the mainstream and largely defanged. The average consumer, face pierced and body tattooed, sees themselves as a rebel while they purchase the hottest rebel brand clothing, carry a firearm that's popular with rebels but made and sold by a corp, and drink the energy drinks only true rebels drink, manufactured for pennies on the dollar abroad and sold for €5 to you in Night City where everyone's a rebel. How many of my viewers, as small of a channel as this is currently especially, have stopped to consider what a world without capitalism would truly look like? Not just in theory, not just in the background, but realistically. How many folks that you pass on the street, or more likely in 2020, in their cars driving by around you, have thought about a world without capitalism? If you're anything like me, you may have even tried to imagine that world, found that you struggled, or kept accidentally inventing capitalism again while you evaluated different models. As a millennial American, it's very hard to divorce the concept of reality from the concept of capitalism, yet we do still consider them two distinct entities. In Cyberpunk, that philosophical distinction has fully dissolved, and instead we have this phrase: the biz. Every time a character references the biz, they are referencing hustling, they are referencing market-based philosophy, value-ranked hierarchies, and a dog-eat-dog mindset. They are referencing every interpretation of capitalism at the same time, liquidated into its most pure form. The biz is the dominant political and personal philosophy in Night City, and I find it hard to dispel the idea that this biz is pretty damn close to the dominant philosophy of the standard off-the-street American. This phrase, a sort of amalgamated peak capitalism even beyond late stage, is the programming and the mode of existence that your player character V must grapple with during most of the narrative choices in the game. Do you give in to this brutal worldview where life is cheap and you only get what you deserve? Or do you treat human life and existence with an inherent reverence and try to engage in harm reduction amid this indeed extremely brutal world where life is, objectively, cheap? This choice is, effectively, the very first narrative decision you will make. The backgrounds lay this out fairly bare. Do you choose Corpo, the textbook businessman who's a cog in the wheel of oppression and getting paid handsomely to do so? Or Street Kid, the class at or near the bottom of society whose individuality is secondary to the faceless archetype of consumer that they represent and rebel against? Or a nomad, the outsider who has taken steps to distance themselves from the system yet finds that they must interact with the great machine regardless? Is this theme handled brilliantly in-game? No, I think not. At the very least, it could have been presented in a less buggy and chaotic way, no doubt, but to claim that it's not there at all and Cyberpunk is strictly an aesthetic on top of a run-of-the-mill FPS game is, in my view, provably incorrect. On the other hand, let's see how many dislikes I get for this opinion. Slapping the Cyberpunk aesthetic and other vague associated themes onto a shooter RPG frame is largely how I viewed the contemporary Deus Ex games. That's a debate for another video though. So, why aren't more people talking about this artistic statement aspect of the game? Well, I'll be frank, it's because the game was rushed and the biz that is the game industry has led to a lot of missed promises that end up with a lot of people feeling deceived. There's still plenty to discuss regarding the game as a piece of commoditized entertainment, and indeed that is the standard model of analysis for the press, so it's no surprise that artistic analysis is being drowned out when there's so many buyer beware topics to cover first. But, putting all that aside, why aren't more people discussing the themes of this game? Section 2. It's still a video game. Video games are still a commodity under capitalism, just like books, music, movies, novels, poetry, and everything. Everything with a price tag, at least. With a commodity, the value has to be obvious or else the free market will evaluate it as worthless. However, video games still have the capacity for artistic statements just like all those other artistic mediums, but to what degree you engage with this is largely up to you, regardless of the authorial intent. Most game authors, whether it's a single writer or an entire studio, want to include some kind of authentic artistic statement, subconsciously or consciously, as is the case for virtually all creative endeavors. This does not seem to be the case, however, for the biz, or the AAA pipeline that is dominated by executives, investors, and marketing. For example, a deep reading of most Call of Duty games can only go so far before you start analyzing cultural and historical tropes that the game is invoking rather than any original statements of the game's narrative or world building itself. Did you know that governments might do bad things sometimes, even if they seem like they have good reasons to? This appears to be about as deep as most modern FPS games are able or willing to go with their statements. And indeed, for a lot of their intended audience, even that message will be considered deep or maybe even profound, and I applaud any writer or developer that chooses to include this under-mainstream message over the choice of letting your message be interpreted accidentally by the mainstream alone. I argue that Cyberpunk does not offer a comparable level of meaning ceiling as those other AAA examples, while maintaining a fairly approachable level of meaning floor that AAA consumers are more used to. To very briefly explain, I'm invoking the concept of skill ceilings and floors. TLDR, a game or class or weapon or mechanic's skill floor, is where you start when you first touch that item, whereas the ceiling is the limit that the most skilled manipulator of that item can achieve at peak performance. I'll put a link below to a great video on skill floors and ceilings by a small YouTuber that I recommend for further reading on this concept. It's one of my favorite discussion points in game design, and others have already covered it brilliantly. Section 3. You get what you put in. And I put in dissent. I find that the average non-artiste interaction with media tends to be transactional and results-oriented. Most people are just looking for a way to unwind after a hard day or maybe even hard life of existing within the coercion inherent to liberal capitalism. I'm not here to declare that type of self-soothing as wrong or even simple-minded. I think it's very logical and not something that should be criticized as always wrong. But I am here to offer expanded options when it comes to consumption. In my everyday life, I advocate and try to practice something that may be best described as active consumption. If you're one of the union-friendly audience members, I chalk this up to my second function as an INTP, extroverted intuition, summarized, by my understanding, as an insatiable curiosity and impulse to connect everything with everything else in any way I can. I personally am thankful for my first function, introverted thinking, giving me this capability of breaking everything I perceive down to its component parts and finding ways to intuitively connect the dots from there rather than from the whole, or some of its parts, primarily. And if you're not in a union theory, don't worry, that was it, and you probably didn't miss that much. When I booted up Cyberpunk 2077 for the first time, I knew right away that Nomad was for me. I've been aware adjacent of the Cyberpunk universe for quite some time, since it pops up occasionally in board games and of course tabletop RPGs. I've always been a punk-curious nerd, as I covered earlier. However, I've never engaged with Cyberpunk genre fiction outside of the framework of theme in a couple of tabletop games I've learned and played like once. I'm a guy that still hasn't gotten around to watching any form of Blade Runner, for example, and I keep trying to get into Ghost in the Shell but never seem to get invested past the very first movie. I even thought Akira was an extremely boring movie when I watched it as a teen with a limited and sheltered worldview, although I've strongly flipped my opinion after watching it again last year with my wife. I knew there were street samurai and Asian influences mixed throughout, with high-tech netrunner hackers in a hyper-capitalist corporate world. Armed with only that info and my rebellious leftist punk spirit that has finally coalesced inside myself as an adult, I wanted to see if I could be an anarchist in this game just to pull it off. Nomad seemed to be the most likely avenue to live out that roleplay, so that's what I chose for my main playthrough. I've dabbled in the other backgrounds between alts and YouTube Let's Plays as well. Here is the clearest area where I agree with the discussion zeitgeist around this game. As a choice, this background felt pretty inconsequential. As a general disclaimer, I have not beat this game and I don't expect to have done so anytime soon. Personally, I disagree with the sentiment that you need to have beat a game, read an entire book series, or consumed every part of an extended universe to have opinions about fictional media, but you should disclose this fact when engaging in a critical discussion so that others are aware of your incomplete perspective. I'd also argue there's no such thing as a complete perspective from an objective standpoint, but I digress. However, I did find that this choice was, perhaps, a little more influential in my experience than the concrete facts would indicate. I found myself able to actually roleplay my version of V while playing fairly easily. In fact, I'd say this was the most impressive aspect of CD Projekt Red's style of game development, since I felt this way with Geralt as well. Very few single-player games actually invoke the feeling that I've experienced during the most positive tabletop role-playing sessions I've had, but now I've had this feeling in both of their games since becoming AAA with The Witcher 3. Another notable example of this is Disco Elysium, and I have been wondering if the final Cyberpunk 2077 product would have better served its narrative goals if it was not an action game at all and stuck to the realm of adventure and RPG like Disco does, but the biz demands action. If I was going to attempt to convey this abstract feeling, a vibe even, it would be thusly: true immersion. And I do not mean the "my immersion" types of arguments that pop up in gaming discussions when talking about the value of high-fidelity graphics, although that may be related. What I mean is true immersion, a psychic immersion into the game world where the lines between my avatar and myself have blurred to the point of disappearing in my psyche. I can always tell I'm in this true playing of a role mode when I realize that I've been inferring a narrative to my character's actions that are of my own invention, rather than the game designer's, and they're not directly portrayed in the game, a filling in of the blanks. I know I'm immersed emotionally when I imagine what my character is getting up to during the fast travel and time skip portions of gameplay. Bonus tip for tabletop DMs, asking your players to think about this and share is one of the best ways to get your party to think of their characters as real. For example, when my V decides to non-lethally subdue a ganger but have zero remorse about filling some corporo shill full of buckshot, that is a layer of thought process similar to my real-life behavior analysis that I am running to justify those decisions and have a personality. Not only am I, to some degree, relating to my character and deciding what I would do in that situation, I'm also understanding the life perspective that I, as V, would have gone through to get to this point in life. That, in my opinion, is true role-playing. You're neither yourself, nor are you a discrete individual separate from yourself. You have become a version of yourself, but different, an aspect. I have a feeling that this is not that dissimilar from the extended fugue state that a method actor chases, and I find this feeling is something that I chase for my own entertainment, and I personally never felt from non-interactive medium like TV or movies. Novels still invoke some layer of creative gap filling, but I personally have had this feeling most often while playing single-player games. I also consider it a triumph that Cyberpunk 2077 manages to serve a huge, dense game world while still offering enough details to get me to that level of immersion. Unfortunately, it is much more fragile than other games that are free of bugs, strange design decisions, and corner cutting that this poor game has had to go through. And I think it's extremely valid to call out those shortcomings, even though it does feel strange that this is all mainstream seems to want to talk about right now. Section 4. But what does Cyberpunk do with that immersion? Well, that depends on what you want it to do to you. For me, I found a world that reflects our own, but more so. The next step in our cultural progress should we not have some massive intervention, or revolution one might say. This is not a vision of a fallen world, just one that is kept existing, and the residents of this world don't believe they're in the apocalypse because it's happening so slowly all around them. I believe it's worth celebrating that the developers and writers were able to convey this complex commentary in spite of all the technical issues and capitalist pressure to create a commodified product rather than a piece of art. And I do hope that the game is cleaned up over time so that we can access that immersive feeling more easily, that flow or fugue state, without as much grit to distract. After all, it's only recently that we've had the tech to allow a game to be fixed after launch, yet is it not the same ability to fix a game after launch that leads to so many corporate decisions to knowingly release a buggy or incomplete or rushed game in the first place? Doesn't it kind of seem like there's an inductive logic at play that both leads to and solves this problem? Like there's a problem that was only created by the solution to the same problem. In a certain way, for those willing to open their understanding to this sort of analysis, isn't that what capitalism does to all of us? Offer solutions to problems that are created by capitalism itself and then call itself our only savior? By immersing you in its world, but also just as frequently jerking you out of that immersive feeling with its bugs or issues, Cyberpunk 2077 accidentally becomes a profound sort of performance art. It lets you dip your feet into the warm bath of that homey immersion feeling, but also fights against itself when someone glitches up into the air during an animation, or you hear a cop car come screaming to a halt near you and then see nothing until it suddenly pops into existence. By no means were these experiences intended, but yet we still feel the effects. No one intended market economics, supply and demand theory, or laissez-faire capitalism to lead to the point where basic human necessities like water have to be branded and commodified as quote-unquote real water TM. But yet, we still see that same dynamic propagating and happening all around us at an increasing frequency and volume. No one is, quote-unquote, putting a gun to your head to live in Night City. No one is forcing its residents to turn to crime, but it sure seems like that's the only realistic outcome for most of them with the incentives and systems they're living under, doesn't it? It's capitalist realism all the way down, baby. At least if that word meant what it's literally describing, rather than being the justifying ideology that its proponents latch onto and twist it into, regardless of their own cultural biases, willful or otherwise. Section 5. So wasn't this supposed to be about some socialist message in the game or something? Nope. Well, not explicitly. As I mentioned earlier, you get out of an artistic experience what you put in, to some degree. I may be especially cognizant of what I'm putting in, but I'd wager that most people are paying a little less attention to themselves while they're trying to play a video game. Again, see the daily coercive pressure of capitalism, and they may be surprised at what they actually get back out. I don't mean that sentiment in some kind of elevated, bourgeoisie, enlightened way where I'm the ultimate arbiter of art and what it means, of course. Obviously, I too was surprised at what I was reading from my experience of the game, but the entire point of this video is to outline that I did, indeed, have and hope to continue having a transformative artistic experience from this title. The game is, for me, gestalt, more than the sum of its parts, and that's not something I can truthfully say about the vast majority of AAA video games out there in my experience. I theorize that some percentage of players of Cyberpunk 2077 will get a similar message as the one I've been describing, even if they're more or less aware of themselves than I. Trust me, I'm sure plenty of people will absolutely love playing as a corpo capitalist and go through Night City murdering the poor and rich in equal measure, looting the proletariat, and not even think twice. But that's the most elegant part of this game. It reflects the real world in that way. You get what you put in. Put in aggression and hate, and you'll see your worldview reflected back at you. You're a shark surrounded only by other sharks and food, and you have to kill the competition. Put in some empathy, maybe some extra observation and introspection, and you might get something back that's a little more critical of the fictional future portrayed here. You might realize that a mirror is being held up to you, literally multiple points throughout the game, and maybe you start to realize that you don't quite like what you're seeing in yourself or those around you. Maybe you don't even realize it at the time, but sometime later, as you're going about your business in real life, you see some person that kind of looks like a citizen off the street in Cyberpunk, or a billboard ad that seems a little over the top, and you think, hey, that kind of looks like Cyberpunk. And at that point, you're right next door to realizing just how much like that brutal world our own real world can be. Even more likely than all that is the fact that this game, like almost all RPGs, is extremely long form, and so exposes you to these ideas in varying intensities over a very long period of time. Existing in an artistic medium for a long time, I'm inferring from lived experience, has a tendency to alter or invade your subconscious far more than a 5-hour mobile game experience or even playing 2 or 3 multiplayer matches a day over the course of a year. Those games may be something you manipulate and play with, but a long-form single-player RPG is something you tend to soak in and sink into. Closing. So what am I even trying to say? There's one thing I can say for sure. Cyberpunk 2077, and indeed most of the cyberpunk genre, is trying to make you feel something in those metallic limbs and non-human organs deep within you. The non-human parts of you that you've already sold off to capitalism, whether you've realized it yet or never will realize it. And actually, you can feel in those missing and altered organs of humanity because you haven't sold anything physical. Slavery is, after all, illegal, so you can only lease your physical body, but you can sell your psychic body and your psyche. At least that's what everyone who's looking to buy wants you to think. Cyberpunk's artistic statement, by my analysis, is to make you aware of an aspect of your humanity that you likely took for granted your entire life, and may have never even noticed its existence in the first place. Outside of the loose definition of a soul, or perhaps the phrase humanity itself, we don't really discuss this sort of thing very often in modern life. And here we discover why this makes for such effective agitative propaganda. Simply making you aware of this within yourself is the message. Now, if you had a public school education like I did in California, you may have learned that propaganda is when someone, usually a government they tell you, lies to you to persuade you. And that's not wrong, but it's not the whole story. True propaganda, just like the most skillful lies, doesn't just make things up, it exaggerates reality and tells partial truths. Because propaganda makers know this universal truth. There is no universal truth. Objectivity isn't so objective, just as objective as possible at the time. At no point is Cyberpunk's worldview trying to make you think just one thing though. Instead, it is showing a flat cause and effect cycle and letting you make your own judgments. Although it will gladly present a few possible interpretations, those are always presented in-world, much like real philosophy, and it'll be up to you to believe it or don't. But if you start to see enough injustice, enough crimes against whatever humanity you or your fellow humans have left, perhaps you might start feeling a little shorted in your lot in life. Maybe you'll start to feel a bit more agitated the next time you have a giant, distracting, and sexualized ad in your face when you're in the middle of a nice daydream while walking or driving. And subconsciously, or consciously, you start to connect a few more dots on the cause and effect pipeline that led you here and into this emotional space than you would have without playing this game and receiving this artistic message. Some percentage of people who go into this game will come out with a little more insight on where they might want to focus that agitation, possibly even turned into rage, when they brush up with the machine, the biz, and all its ramifications that they've seen portrayed so plainly in the world of Cyberpunk 2077. And this is what it means to be agitprop, or agitating propaganda, to equip you with new tools to view your world perhaps a little more critically than you did before, and to let you decide what to do with that information. Organize, rebel, start a band with friends, make art, vote, stop voting, throw a milkshake, take an oath of pacifism, or buy a gun, whatever. Perhaps even reinforce your decision to do nothing and remain, quote, apolitical. Anything besides remaining ignorant. There you have it. That's what I see portrayed in the world of Cyberpunk 2077 and how you can observe the greatest gift that all artistic media has to bestow upon you, if you can get past the technical issues and are able to receive its interpretive statements. The gift is the perspective you bring back with you from this mental trip and the act of existing in a different time and place from your own, even as someone who is not entirely you. You may come back from Night City not with the fatalist viewpoint of the post-apocalypse or the sociopath's excuses to mistreat others, but with an understanding of the facts that inform another's worldview and perspective of where we are actively heading as a species. It's up to you to interpret that worldview, just like it'll be and currently is up to you to form your own worldview of reality and decide what you allow to even be reality. Even as humanity is sprinting away from its origins in nature as uplifted monkeys descended from tiny protozoa, we are still limited and perhaps blessed by the most primal of forces, the human condition. Whatever the hell that is, Choom. Anyway, thanks for listening and thank you for your time, and I appreciate you.